The young and the restless spoilers, the most dangerous betrayals are never the loud ones at first. They begin in silence, in the cold, private corners of power, in the moment one person decides that another family's destruction is not only acceptable but necessary. That is what makes this nightmare unfolding in Genoa City feel so much darker than an ordinary feud. This is no longer about rivalry, reputation, or one more vicious round in the endless war between dynasties. This is about annihilation. It is about Victor Newman crossing the final line, moving beyond intimidation and psychological warfare into something far more unforgivable. And the true horror of it is not only that he was willing to do it, but that he believed he had the right. Nikki Newman is the first one to fully see the abyss. She has spent enough years beside Victor to recognize the difference between his usual ruthless games and the rare moments when something far more chilling takes hold of him. She knows the rhythm of his languor, the shape of his obsessions, the way he convinces himself that cruelty is merely strength wearing a sharper face. But even for Nikki, this discovery lands like a physical blow. When she sees the messages, when she realizes that Victor's intention is not to humiliate Jack Abbott, not to ruin Diane, not to manipulate Kyle, but to erase them altogether, the ground beneath her shifts. There are some revelations that do not leave room for denial, and this is one of them. In that instant, the marriage, the loyalty, the decades of compromise, the excuses she has made to survive loving a man like Victor, all of it becomes a burden pressing against her chest. The horror is not abstract. It is specific. Patty Williams has been chosen as the instrument of destruction, a woman unstable enough, obsessive enough, and emotionally distorted enough to be used as the perfect vessel for someone else's hatred. Victor's calculation is what makes this so monstrous. He is not merely plotting murder. He is outsourcing it to madness, wrapping his intent in someone else's instability so that even the crime itself could be disguised as chaos. A box of poison small enough to fit in a handbag becomes the symbol of just how far he has fallen. The Abbott family is not being threatened in public. They are being sentenced in secret. Patty, of course, is the worst possible person to place in such a scheme because her obsession with Jack has never needed much encouragement to become destructive. In her fractured mind, love and possession have always blurred together. Now, armed with Victor's approval and a deadly tool, she is more dangerous than ever. She does not see herself as a killer in the conventional sense. She sees herself as someone correcting fate, clearing away obstacles, punishing those who stand between her and the fantasies she has built around Jack. That is what makes her terrifying. She is not driven by greed or cold logic. She is driven by belief. And belief, when corrupted, can be more frightening than calculation. Nikki understands all of this in seconds, but the brilliance of the moment is not in panic. It is in restraint. She knows that screaming, confronting Victor immediately, or exposing what she knows too early could get people killed. This is where Nikki becomes far more compelling than she is often given credit for. Too many people reduce her to the woman who loves Victor, the woman who forgives too much, the woman forever trapped between devotion and disgust. But here she becomes something else entirely, a witness who refuses to stay passive. She does not collapse. She does not indulge in self-pity. She becomes cold, careful, focused. In some ways, she becomes as strategic as Victor himself, and that is perhaps the most poetic turn of all. The woman who has lived in the shadow of his methods decides to use discipline against him, not for him. Her fear is immediate, but so is her intelligence. Nikki knows she cannot make a single wrong move. Victor is at his most dangerous when cornered, and Patty is far too unstable to predict. Every second matters. Every breath has to be measured. There is a terrifying loneliness in that realization because Nikki cannot even afford the comfort of a breakdown. She has to hold the horror inside while acting normal enough not to alert the man she now understands may be capable of destroying multiple lives before nightfall. It is a devastating emotional position. The person she has defended, the man she has shared her life with, the father of her children, has become the threat she must stop. The Abbott family, meanwhile, is drifting toward disaster without realizing how close death is. Jack Abbott has already been fighting on too many fronts at once. Patty's presence in his life has reopened old trauma, Diane's trust is shaken, Kyle is furious, and the house itself no longer feels like a sanctuary. The Abbott mansion, once a symbol of legacy and continuity, begins to take on the atmosphere of a trap. That is what makes the poison plot so chilling. It turns domestic space into a killing ground. Meals, drinks, shared family moments, the ordinary rituals of closeness all become vulnerable to corruption. There is something uniquely cruel about murder by poison because it does not merely end life. It contaminates trust itself. It transforms care into threat, hospitality into danger, home into terror. Jack is already brittle in ways he would never admit aloud. The ordeal with Patty on the yacht and her shameless return to his home have left him humiliated, angry, and deeply unsettled. He is trying to maintain dignity, trying to keep Diane from slipping further away, trying to protect Kyle from the emotional wreckage, and now, without even knowing it, he is standing directly in the path of something far deadlier. His tragedy in this storyline is that he is exhausted before the real catastrophe even arrives. He is cleaning up one mess while another much darker one is assembling behind the walls. Diane Jenkins is no less vulnerable, though her vulnerability looks different. Diane is a woman who has clawed her way back into legitimacy, into family, into love, only to find herself again cast as the target of hatred, suspicion, and vendetta. Victor wanting her dead is not merely another escalation of an old feud. It is the final confirmation that he sees her existence as intolerable. And that truth would cut Diane in a way deeper than fear. Because for Diane, the battle has always been about proving that she deserves to remain to be part of this family, to stop living as the perpetual outsider. A murder plot against her does not just threaten her life. It validates every fear she has ever had about how fragile her place really is. Kyle Abbott, as always, is caught in the middle, but that phrase almost understates the damage. He is not passively in the middle. He is being crushed there. He sees his parents struggling, sees Victor's fingerprints on every disaster, sees Patty's obsession poisoning the household, and all of it feeds the anger that has been building inside him for far too long. Kyle has often tried to present himself as measured, modern, more emotionally intelligent than the generation before him, but there is still Abbott pride and rage in him, and this kind of threat is exactly the sort that can turn controlled resentment into reckless action. If he were to learn that Victor had truly marked his family for death, the reaction would not be mild, it would be volcanic, and that is one of the strongest aspects of this plot. It forces characters into moral corners where their best selves may not survive. Nikki must choose between husband and justice. Jack, if he learns the truth, must confront the reality that his longtime enemy has crossed from war into extermination. Diane must decide whether survival matters more than reconciliation, whether she should flee or stand her ground. Kyle must fight the urge to answer lethal intent with violence of his own. This is the kind of writing that works when it understands that emotional collapse is often more compelling than physical danger. The poison is horrifying, yes, but the real suspense lies in what knowledge of the poison will do to everyone involved. When Nikki secretly passes intelligence to the police, the act carries enormous emotional weight because it is not simply betrayal, it is self-betrayal too. To expose Victor is to expose everything Nikki has tolerated for years, every rationalization, every time she looked away because the truth was too painful or the alternative too complicated. That is why her decision feels almost like a breaking point in her own soul. She is not only turning Victor in, she is admitting privately and perhaps for the first time, without excuse, that the man she loves is capable of evil that can no longer be reframed as strategy. In my view, that is where the plot becomes more than sensational. It becomes tragic in a mature, painful way. The police intervention, when it comes, is not triumphant. It is horrifying. That is important. There should be no clean satisfaction in a moment like this, only shock, urgency, and the unbearable awareness of what almost happened. Victor and Patty being stopped with the poison still in their possession, turns abstract terror into undeniable reality. No one can spin it away. No one can call it a misunderstanding. The vile, small, and lethal becomes the proof that strips away every defense. Even the police, hardened by years of crime and scandal, are shaken, because a poison plot against an entire family does not feel like ordinary criminality. It feels medieval in its coldness, aristocratic in its arrogance, intimate in its cruelty. Patty's arrest would likely be chaotic, emotional, unstable, perhaps filled with frantic insistence that she was helping Jack, saving him, preserving their future. That reaction would only make the scene more unnerving. She would not experience herself as the villain. She would see herself as the chosen hand of destiny, interrupted by people too blind to understand what she was trying to do. Victor, however, would be different. The most powerful choice in this story is not just that he is arrested, but that he is forced to confess. Not because confession redeems him, but because it tears the mask away. A man like Victor thrives on control, on mystery, on the aura that he alone understands the board better than everyone else. To be made to say it aloud, to acknowledge that he intended to wipe out Jack, Diane, and Kyle is a humiliation more devastating to him than prison itself. And yet, even in confession, Victor would remain Victor. He would not weep. He would not beg. He would likely frame it as necessity, as consequence, as the unavoidable endpoint of a war Jack and Diane helped prolong, simply by continuing to exist in his world as intolerable irritants. That is what makes him so compelling and so monstrous at once. He can always narrate his own cruelty as duty. He can always convince himself that his hand was forced. But there comes a point when intelligence curdles into tyranny, and this plot drags him fully into that territory. The fallout from his arrest would be immense. Nikki would not feel victorious. She would feel gutted, because justice does not erase love. It only punishes what love could not save. Her children, especially Victoria, would likely be torn between outrage at Victor's actions and resentment toward Nikki for being the one who set his downfall in motion. That is another bitter layer to this story. Even when Nikki does the morally correct thing, she may still be treated as the destroyer of family unity. That is the curse of being the one who tells the truth after everyone has grown comfortable around a lie. Victoria's reaction in particular could be explosive. She has spent years defending Victor, interpreting his excesses as strength, his manipulations as protective instinct, his vendettas as necessary evils in a brutal world. To be confronted with a literal murder plot would shatter the moral scaffolding she has built around him. She might resist it at first, try to question the evidence, try to blame Patty alone, try to preserve the version of her father that has shaped her entire life. But the confession would make denial harder. And once denial cracks, grief and rage come roaring through, the father she worshipped would be exposed, not as flawed, but as monstrous in a way that cannot be softened. For Jack and Diane, survival would come with a grotesque aftertaste. How do you return to normal family dinners after learning that poison was meant for your table? How do you sleep in a house that became the target of extermination? How do you talk about Victor as merely an enemy after discovering he was prepared to kill your son along with you? The emotional consequences would not end with the arrests. They would deepen. Jack's anger would likely become colder, less theatrical, more permanent. Diane's fear would likely transform into something harder, a conviction that survival requires a level of vigilance she can never again abandon. Kyle, meanwhile, would emerge from the ordeal with his innocence about the limits of this family war permanently destroyed. One of the most interesting and painful possibilities is that the Abbott family, despite being saved, would not emerge united in a simple way. Trauma rarely works like that. Jack may become more controlling out of fear. Diane may want distance, security, escape. Kyle may become consumed with revenge, even though the legal system has already acted. Near death has a way of exposing not only love, but fractures. In some ways, Victor's plot might succeed emotionally even in failure, because once you learn someone tried to erase your family, peace becomes far more difficult to trust. There is also a larger thematic point here that I think makes the storyline powerful if handled with enough emotional honesty. This is not just about Victor becoming evil. It is about the long-term consequence of a life spent treating other people as pieces on a board. For years, Victor has manipulated, coerced, abducted, lied, schemed, and justified it, all through the language of protection, power, and legacy. A poison plot is shocking, yes, but it is also the logical endpoint of unrestrained entitlement. When a man convinces himself long enough that his will is law, murder stops feeling impossible. It starts feeling like one more option. That is why this story should not be treated as a sudden transformation, but as a culmination. And Nikki's role as the one who stops it matters for the same reason. She is not just the wife who finally turns. She is the conscience of a lifetime finally refusing to be silent. She has seen the cost of Victor's methods in others for years, but now she sees that cost expanding into irreversible bloodshed. Her choice to act is not a rejection of her past feelings. It is the most painful proof that she still has a soul strong enough to recognize horror when it stands in front of her wearing her husband's face. In the end, the arrests of Victor and Patty would not feel like a neat ending. They would feel like the violent tearing open of truths that everyone has avoided too long. Victor's imprisonment would be historic not because it punishes him, but because it finally places a boundary around a man who has lived too long without one. Patty's downfall would be both deserved and tragic, the collapse of a woman whose obsession made her easy to use and impossible to trust. Nikki would be left to mourn not just a marriage, but an illusion. Jack and Diane would be forced to rebuild from a terror neither of them invited. Kyle would step into a darker adulthood, having seen exactly how ugly these family wars can become. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of all. Poison is silent. It has no dramatic sound, no warning cry, no visible rage attached to it in the moment it is given. It works quietly, invisibly, patiently. That is exactly why this plot feels so terrifying. It mirrors the way hatred itself has moved through these families for years, hidden in smiles, sealed in private messages, carried in elegant rooms by people who call their vengeance strategy. This time, however, the silence breaks. This time, the truth is found before the poison reaches the table. This time, someone chooses to stop the monster before the damage becomes final. But survival does not erase what was intended. It only ensures that everyone must now live with the knowledge of how close death came, how intimate it was, and how it wore the face of someone they thought they understood.